And so today, as we intersect in honest work, let our hopefulness mingle with our conviction. Let our willingness to be honest about the hardest questions open us to new truths. May there truly be more love, with no labels, no binary, no preface, no qualification, no arithmetic, and no limit. May there be more love to liberate us all, and may we keep on today and every day until we find it and share it inch by precious inch with one another and the world. May it be so. Last June 30th, it was a hot one. I don't know if you recall it. And I was standing at the U.S.-Mexico border in that heat with 100 or so other protesters chanting and singing, and I was holding one corner of a "Standing on the Side of Love" banner. And I took all of that in, and I wondered, how did we get here? Now, it wasn't a question of being lost. Head south from Tucson on I-19, and about 40 minutes later, you'll pass my congregation. Keep going, another 30 to 35 minutes, and you'll come into Nogales. There's that left curve of the road. It banks east, and then it arrives at a stoplight on Grand Avenue, and if you take that right turn, just beyond, under the street sign, "Mexico only," is the DeConcini port of entry to Mexico. I've known that port all of my life through many of its changes, and some of my earliest memories are like overexposed Polaroids, crossing the line into Mexico casually and for fun. The current imposing structure looks more like a prison than it does a gateway, and it isn't anything like that space I recall when I was a boy. And yet I still recognize it as the means to Mexico. That Saturday, last June, inside the port, in that zone where we had little to no constitutional rights, no more than 50 feet from Mexico, individuals and the families of protesters from all backgrounds and origins held the border for well over an hour. So I knew exactly where we were, and yet I wondered, how did we get here? It was not a question of the plans for the June 30th event. Peg Bowden, white borderlands activist and author of A Land of Hard Edges, serving the front lines of the border, saw the need and gathered the people. She called everyone that she knew to gather in Nogales for an action combining a rally, a march, and a protest against that separation of migrant children from their families. And in a very short time, Peg created a coalition of organizations. Then she joined the national Move On schedule of events, signed my Amato congregation on as a sponsor for the Keep Families Together Action for the Borderlands. Now, some of the organizations then contacted the media, others reached out to speakers and artists, and some even created flyers. In the spirit of the civil rights movement, my congregation hosted a soulful preparation the night before the action. And as I gathered that group of many faiths, I told them about what Reverend Bill Sinkford, black minister and past president of our Unitarian Universalist Association, and that he sanctified our preparation and coming action with this observation. He said, "We have always been a faith community with a spiritual center and a civic circumference." So we prepared by naming our individual emotions and passions, focusing on our deepest sources, and then orienting on those who were suffering. Families from Central America, seeking asylum in the U.S., detained, separated, parent from child, and those families seeking asylum waiting in overfilled shelters, and there on the sidewalks of Sonora, Mexico, in Nogales, to have their petitions heard. We knew that a few of these families would be waiting on the Mexican side at the DeConcini port just the next day, and that if we raised our voices, if we sang and we chanted and we yelled loud enough, they would know we were there and they could hear us, and they might even feel our support. And after the preparation service at my church, we made posters together like, "Seeking asylum is not a crime. Return the stolen children. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to be free." Earlier that week, some of us had decided that we would risk direct civil disobedience. And for those of you who don't know that tricky little parlance, it means we were going to get arrested. We were ready to give up our freedom and be separated from our families in solidarity with asylum seekers. And so we had consultations with the American Civil Liberties Union and the National Lawyers Guild. We learned our rights, we explored the risks, and together and without judgment, we determined what each of us would be willing to do. And then we planned different, direct, non-violent actions. 2 that risked state and local misdemeanor charges, and 1 that would be a federal crime. And then the day came. Over 300 people gathered at Nasib Karam Park under the shade of the trees surrounding the Nogales border gazebo, a short walking distance from the port. Artists displayed works reflecting our times. Singers wrote and performed new songs. Speakers took the mic, among them Raul Grijalva, Latino congressional representative, and several borderlands clergy preached. I had been invited to speak, but I knew that if you give a few politicians and several clergy a microphone, we might never leave the park. And so I offered to sing "We Shall Overcome" to continue that rally into a march, to transition us. We shall overcome. They are not alone. We are not afraid today. And then we marched through the streets of old Nogales, singing De Colores, chanting "Free our children, we are with you." And in Spanish, "A people united will never be defeated." We ended blocking southbound traffic on Grand Avenue, a crowd closing the port of entry into Mexico. As Nogales police rerouted the traffic to the 2 nearby ports, more than an hour passed, and we saw an opportunity to take a greater risk together, and boldly we marched into the port itself. And we thought surely we would be stopped along the way. We thought definitely we would be warned by U.S. immigration officers that we must leave. We even thought that some of us would be arrested, but none of that happened. And so we marched to the border, and there we raised our voices. With anger, we called for justice. With fear, we called for trust. With grief, we called for love. With confusion, we called for new beginnings. And with shame, we called for dignity. As Peg later reflected, it was a day of righteous bellowing. Before the impassive U.S. immigration officers, we raised our support to the migrant families awaiting for their appeal for asylum, just meters away, just feet away from us on the other side of the line. And in the midst of all of this, my question lingered. How did we get here? How did we, people on both sides of the line, those born here in the borderlands, those come to them more recently, those come seeking safety, freedom, prosperity, those ordered to defend a political boundary and separate children from parents, how did we get to this place? How did we get here? This seems to be a question asked today many places, many times, by people of different backgrounds and even different political persuasions nowadays. We ask it because we do feel lost. Because what is happening in our country and in the world politically and economically and environmentally and socially is radically different from what the world was like when we were younger, or at least what we were promised it was going to be. It feels as if we've departed from what the plan, whatever that truly was, what the plan has been. How did we get here? And no matter who asks it, we seem to only be allowed one kind of answer, one that is shouted with a growing hostility and blame. It is as if, even to ponder aloud, we must scream, as if across a chasm, even though we are close enough to touch one another. For no matter what you might answer to how did we get here, we are all caught up together in a culture of division. This is certainly not new in the history of this country. 160 years ago, white, young Abraham Lincoln acknowledged the division of his time, slavery, while running for the Illinois U.S. Senate seat. And although he lost to Stephen A. Douglas, he evoked the biblical wisdom, a house divided against itself cannot stand. His words were prophetic. I do not expect the union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will be all one thing or all the other. At that time, our Unitarian and Universalist forebears were among those who struggled for the freedom of slaves. And yet they too recognized that the freedom of enslaved black people was tied to the freedom of all. Opposed to the cancer of slavery, Margaret Fuller, white Unitarian and essayist, wrote in 1845, as the friend of the Negro assumes that one man cannot by right hold another in bondage, no friend of woman should assume that man by right can even lay well-intentioned restrictions on women. Fuller saw the intersection of oppressions as uniting justice-seeking people rather than opposing interests which divided them. The Reverend Theodore Parker, white Unitarian abolitionist, in 1850 addressed an anti-slavery convention saying, "There is what I call the American idea." And here Parker hearkens to our Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men have inalienable rights, that in respect thereof all men are created equal, and the government is to be established and sustained for the purpose of giving every man an opportunity for the enjoyment and development of these unalienable rights. This idea demands, he says, a democracy. And it's right there that he drops his male orientation in his language and in his belief. That is, he says, a government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people, and a government after the principles of eternal justice, the unchanging law of God. For shortness' sake, I will call the idea freedom. Even then, the circumference of our faith was civic, while our center was spiritual. Both Fuller and Parker held that being a person of faith and being an American was one. They and many others, Unitarians and Universalists of various ethnic origins and beliefs, with their words and with their actions, set a trajectory for our spirit-centered and civic-minded faith today. Our 7 principles, the covenant of our Unitarian Universalist Association, ring out with this heritage. We affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, the acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Through our heritage and within our association's covenant, there is an alternative then to our culture's divisive and blaming reaction to the question of how did we get here? Our faith tradition offers us a wisdom to understand and engage the world's oppression, marginalization, exploitation, and injustice. How did we get here? And our faith responds, we got here together. We arrived at this time and place with all of its deep and perilous concerns about our planet and its populations as one people, the decent and the indifferent, the compassionate and the cruel, the generous and the greedy, the oppressors and the oppressed have been and always will be one. We created all of this together. And there is hope here. For if we created it, we can dismantle it. But if this wisdom first brings a tinge of despair, you are not alone. I feel it, and there's a growing evidence that our species, 7.6 billion and growing, feels it too. That if we are one, then we are responsible for the problems of our planet, for one another, and for our own broken hearts. Each in our own and some in very terribly flawed ways feels this deeply, and each of us weeps upon a street corner out of grief for our sheer inadequacy and the vastness of the struggle that we cannot even name. Joanna Macy, a white elder activist who I hear attends a Unitarian Universalist church in the San Francisco Bay Area. She teaches that recognizing our despair will spark anger, deepen fear, tear open grief, and cause confounding confusion, and I would add, because I found it to be true, compel guilt and shame. And yet she also teaches that by owning and honoring our pain together, we transform anger into justice, fear into trust, grief into love, confusion into new possibilities, and shame into dignity. And that makes it uncomfortable work. It challenges us to stop shouting and listen, that all hearts are broken on every side. It requires that we stop pointing fingers. Our hands have too much to do to heal. And it demands that we stop denying our interdependence, our abiding mutual need for one another, and live as one. In the weeks that followed the June 30 action, the organizers and organizations, we debriefed, reflecting on what we experienced and what we learned. Among the various reflections, there were two universal responses. One, we are not alone in this work. And two, there is no other. But we are struggling against oppression, not against people. Among voices independent and strong, there is one common recognition of our unity, and that is there is no one to blame, for we did not give that person power. All sides are caught up in our dehumanizing system. Every family is our family. Each child is our child. We are one, and we are not yet done. I want to leave you with a declaration of interdependence that gives me hope, and it comes from our Baja 4 Coordinating Committee. It's a group of members from our 4 congregations. This one, Rex serves, and Betty. Then UUCT, my own congregation in Amato, and Sky Island in Sierra Vista. They work in tandem to create joint programming for us all. Just yesterday, they brought all of our boards together and ministers at my congregation for our 4th annual all-board retreat. They've crafted our first ever joint picnic on November 10th, where they're facilitating the sharing of a tiny house that will visit each congregation throughout 2019. And through the leadership of this congregation, the Baja 4 is helping to gather our collective presidents for the Festival of Books next March. Within all of that, the Baja 4 coordinating team has a greater mission concerning our interdependence. Their mission is this: together we hold more wisdom, more strength, and more resources for the Unitarian Universalist presence in southern Arizona. And we dedicate our work together and with others to the crafting of the beloved community. May we boldly dare to challenge ourselves to hear the call of justice in southern Arizona and to make that beloved community a reality. May it be so.